welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 16 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I want to touch on Mussolini's motherhood factories. Okay. And this was the idea that many liberal sentimentalities are offended by, that a strong push for population growth and domestic motherhood, homemaking, was an ideal standard in Italy in the 1920s and 30s. Well, the fascist system worked with the Catholic Church in Italy in order to set up an ideal social construct of mothers in a home raising children, while fathers became sort of the providers within the realm of the family. Now, for us Catholics, this is pretty much a normal social construct. In a modern world where liberalism dominates, post-Christendom, this is a massive controversy. And it shows, or at least highlights, from their perspective, the tyrannical nature of fascism. And it's one of these sort of subplots when we're looking back at history to say, okay, this is another element of the oppressive fascist nature during the 1920s and 30s from a lot of these Catholic nations, right? In particular, of course, I like to talk about what was going on in Italy at the time. And so, but this topic came up very randomly for me as I was kind of cruising the internet, doing some basic research, and I came across an article that was, well, it drew my attention. Let me see if I can bring it up here and share with you. There's actually two articles, but the first one here, let's see here. Here it is. The first one here is called Mussolini's Motherhood Factories from JS Store Daily, okay? Subtitle, in Fascist Italy, birth rate, breastfeeding, and motherhood were given a hybrid structure of industrial management and eugenicist biological essentialism. That's a whopper of an entry there, right? And the article went on to talk about basically the idea that under Mussolini, Italian motherhood, as I'm reading here, childbirth and breastfeeding were supposed to be streamlined, rationalized, or run along the lines of a factory. The poor and the unmarried especially were propagandized and guided toward clinics called Casa della Madre e della Bambino, under the auspice of Opera Nazionale Maternità e Infanzia. Excuse me, my Italian reading is not so good. Casa della Madre e Bambino, houses of mother and child. Okay, take note how oppressive that is alone. Breastfeeding and childbirth were cast as forms of mass production belonging to the state at the nexus of medical and design history. State imperatives combined pieces of pre-existing gender roles from mass media, the Catholic Church, and medical literature to create a new model for industrial motherhood. Okay. We continue on here. Let's see here. Taylor's breastfeeding continues. Scholar Diana Garvin constitutes a distinctly Italian phenomenon under the fascist 1922-1945. The scientific management of industrial work known as Taylorism, after its American progenitor, Frederick Taylor, was combined with the eugenic ideal of national efficiency. The biological characterization of efficiency meant that the state could quantify mother's bodily energy, function, and output. Weighing the baby before and after feeding, known as doppia peseta, excuse me, doubly weighing, was supposed to be precisely measure amount of breast milk taken by the little one's time breastfeeding. Okay, so anyway, let me stop there. So I think you guys get the gist here, right? It is looking down on the idea that the Italian nation was promoting motherhood, and it was promoting childbirth, population growth. As I've mentioned before, For Mussolini, one of the greatest challenges in his mind, at least at the time, was in order for the Italians to become a global power on the sort of level of America and the British Empire and the French, he needed to grow the population in Italy. And a lot of this comes from that idea or that period in history that Italian population needs to expand. Now, you also combine that with the fact that Italy was a Catholic nation. And everything we're going to be talking about here today, for the most part, I believe the church went with and was behind Mussolini on this thing, because in many ways, this is what Catholic civilization is. It is a patriarchal structure to a certain extent, and women and men have their roles in society. And that's the irony of it all. In the liberal West, post Christendom, we've kind of lost our senses into what gender roles actually are. This is why we can't even figure out what a man is or what a woman is anymore, right? Everything has become subjective because the moral authority, that arbiter of truth, which was the Christian faith through the church, has been sort of, cast asunder throughout history since the end of World War II. And with that, we've seen really the destruction of civilization and culture and family. And yet we still have to deal with these liberal sentimentalities of these sort of these biases of fluid gender and familial structures that have brought us to the brink of collapse. And we have to deal with this somehow when we look at history in a negative light. And then we got to go back and re-explain this whole thing to people, right? Right. Now, so that was the first article that came up today. And you can see there, the babies, and there's a program put in place, apparently. Now, listen, I can't go too much into detail on this. I am just reacting based upon the articles I found. The problem, again, is, guys, I have trouble finding resources in English. A lot of the stuff from Fascist Italy has never been translated over into English, right? We've had commenters and books written and some theses done by some people, but it's also weaving through this giant web of liberalism, right? That wants to look at other system of governances, right? Did not embrace liberalism. And of course, we have to cast doubt on those systems in a way to boost our own morality in our system here today. And this is a classic example of that when you read into this. Now, as far as what role a government should have in regards to birth rates, whether it should care or not, whether it should foster program, am I going to get into the areas of subsidiarity and sociological sort of analysis on what is the best method or scientific ideas that would actually get the population to start increasing? I'm not a sociologist. I am not going to sit here and say, okay, what the fascist system did in Mussolini in the 20s and 30s was actually the greatest system in the history of the world to get the population in Italy to grow. I'm not here to judge it based upon whether it succeeded or it failed. What I'm here to do is to argue from an ideological premise where both civilizations are, what were the intentions, and what were the moral goals at the end of the day between both societies. Because we're putting a moral judgment on that civilization of another time, of another culture, of another people with different values from 21st century liberal eyes, and putting our values on that system. And this is part of the problem with judging history through the prism of liberalism. We do this a lot. We're better than everybody else, right? We're the shining city in the hill, the last best hope for mankind. Capitalism is the greatest history in the world. Economic prosperity. We're number one. Everybody else were either the bad guys or they were backward ass, right? This is why I always joke around how, as Americans, oftentimes we wind up always pissing on the graves of our ancestors because we were so much better than our grandparents and our great grandparents and our great 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 grandparents, right? We do this to build up our liberal morale in modern times. And so when this article first appeared yesterday morning to me, it was interesting because you got to remember, guys, I'm coming at this from my own bias in many ways. And my bias is quite simple. My father was born to a poor Sicilian family in November of 1935. My father was the youngest of 7 siblings, born under the regime of Benito Mussolini. And being the youngest, having 6 other siblings, all about a year or two apart, when we talk about this, let's call it a program in fascist Italy called the Battle for Births, right? This program ran between 1927 and 1937. If we do the timing of this, I think every one of my father's siblings, along with my father, were all born in the midst of this period in history that the fascist regime under Mussolini was pushing population growth. And of course, the first thing that hits me, coming from this poor family, being the youngest, my father, of 7 siblings, is, well, is my existence here because of Mussolini's motherhood factories? That's the first question I ask myself. And while I'll never know the answer to that question in great details, whether my grandparents looked at Mussolini's policies or were affected by Mussolini's policies, I can say this much: it didn't hurt what the fascist regime was doing at the time to my overall possibility of existence, of being here with you today. It couldn't have hurt, since they were pushing motherhood, since they were pushing childbirth. And when you talk about a Sicilian island that was extremely poor at the time for various economic reasons, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what we have today in America, because in America, we have come, despite our supposed economic prosperity, we have done the opposite in liberal nations, right? It's like I always joke, if my parents were not Sicilian born, if they were not born in a Catholic culture and society, right? Let's just skip ahead of what we have in America today. If my parents were poor in an Anglo-Protestant nation like America, would I be here today with my father being the youngest, right? Same scenario, right? I'm trying to draw a parallel here, because in America, what do American-born families generally do now? What do we do here? We contracept and we abort our families out of existence. This is why the American birth rate is down to 1.6 per family. You need 2.1 in order to just sustain your population. We're not doing that. Part of the reason why we have all this, this immigration coming into the nation. I mean, obviously there's political machinations there. Don't get me wrong, I get that too. But let's be honest here for a second. And so we have a situation here where you have a Catholic nation that has chosen to expand its population, promote motherhood. Again, whether this is the proper method to actually do that, whether this program was going to succeed, I don't really care about that, to be honest with you. I mean, we could talk about that, and these articles will talk about it and address it, and it's a matter of analyzing statistics, and there's lots of nuance there. But the idea that we would encourage motherhood in a patriarchal structure, I know that offends our liberal sensibilities. I know freedom, liberty, feminism, all this stuff that has indoctrinated our minds in America and in these Western liberal republics post-World War II. It's quite remarkable because we still don't really differentiate between the collapse of culture and all these liberal ideas that we now champion, right? The West is dying. It's not just America, it's all of the West that has been liberalized since the end of World War II. We're not having kids. The family is broken. Illegitimacy has skyrocketed. And the interesting thing about this is that from the liberal paradigm, they actually suggest that child born out of wedlock is not necessarily a bad thing, and how when these Catholic nations look down on these out of wedlock births, somehow That's a negative connotation. The mean-spiritedness of Catholic societies, or in this case, the fascist society that discouraged out of wedlock births and how certain women were discriminated against in that culture and society. Well, sure, because out of wedlock births cause social destruction. We're living through that today in the West. We're living through that through many communities in America that have vast amounts of out of wedlock births, and those communities are all falling apart. The liberal mindset is nonsensical. And when we're judging Mussolini's Italy or any really Catholic society or culture, it's quite amazing to see not only the liberal bias, but the sickness of the liberal mind that has lost its complete moral compass in determining not only what right and wrong is, but what a healthy society looks like and what a sick society looks like. That's what's fascinating about all this, right? Now, again, as far as government intervention and subsidiarity and how the government should be, I'm not going to get into that. That's another conversation, but I will say this. If you find a church document or an encyclical from the time that condemned this method from the fascists, please pass it along, because I haven't found one yet. Because in many ways, the church was happy when Mussolini banned contraception and banned abortion in 1926. Did you hear that? Did you hear what I just said? Mussolini banned contraception and abortion in 1926. Catholics, think about what that means. Wouldn't that be a dream come true in many ways if we did that now in America or the West to help solidify many of the social disorders? Again, the liberal paradigm. I know I'm not going to get liberals or progressives to agree with me on this, but for you conservatives that have dismissed again, what Catholic nations did in the 20s and 30s, because you've been brainwashed into or by the liberal system to believe that all those societies were purely evil. And granted, they were fallen societies and they had their problems. Can we have a more nuanced view of history rather than this makeshift history simply to boost our own egos in the West in modern times? Can we have a nuanced discussion? And maybe those societies weren't so crazy after all. Maybe they had some valid points, right? Right? Okay, let's move on. So after finding this article here, I did a basic search and then I came across this one, right? Fascist Italy, The Battle for Births by Howard Fisher. Okay, now who's Howard Fisher? I don't know who Howard Fisher is, but it says down here, Howard Fisher is a MD, was a professor of pediatrics at Wayne State University School of Medicine, Detroit, Michigan. He wrote an article on what was going on in Italy during that period, in the period of history of the battle for the births under Mussolini. And of course, we do what we always do. We begin with, Nazi Germany, Franco Spain, and fascist Italy needed to encourage the birth of babies. Of course, they kind of put everybody into the same nest. The Nazis arranged contraception by race. The Franco regime took babies from certain parents and gave it to other parents. That had to do with communism over there, and there's more to that. But of course, we don't ever mention any details or nuance when it comes to that kind of stuff. And of course, the article then goes on to talk about what happened in Italy. Now, I want to read this article. It's short. You can see the whole thing right here, right now, as I pulled it up here. And I like to analyze the article line by line. Okay, here we go. Quote, in 1925, 3 years after coming to power in Italy, the fascist government Benito Mussolini began its attempt to increase the Italian population. The National Organization for the Protection of Maternity and Infancy, OMMI, took control of 5,700 different institutions that cared for women and children. Pregnant women were provided with free food and instructed in hygiene and infant feeding, including financial incentives to breastfeed. Another goal of ONMI was to make women understand the primary role of the fascist women was to produce children. In 1926, the birth, let's see here, excuse me, in 1926, birth control devices and abortion were outlawed as crimes against the state. Sex education became illegal, and the age of consent and age for marriage were lowered. Mussolini wanted the Italian population of 40 million increased to 60 million by 1950. In reality, the 1940 population was 45.5 million. Okay. What's the problem here? What's the problem here? The government is attempting or encouraging the growth of a population, supporting motherhood. It's providing food. It's providing hygiene instruction. It's providing financial incentives to encourage breastfeeding. The government would actually subsidize, the government would actually assist in families having children financially. It had a vested stake in its own population. Totally different than what we do here in the States now, especially with the libertarian mindset that says, well, if you have so many children, that's your responsibility. Don't put the burden on your fellow neighbor and steal from them. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is the issue of the collective good versus individual rights, right? And this is a mindset of Americans to such a degree that now we've created a usury system, economic system in the West where nobody's having kids anymore. You could argue for individual rights, no doubt about it. You want to make that case as a Western liberal, go ahead. But we also have dying populations in the West. You haven't solved the problem in a usury system that's been brought up through, again, American and British Empire liberalism over the past 200 years that has led the family down the path of destruction. You want to argue individual rights over the common good? Fine, go ahead. But you got to address how we're going to increase the population if we don't support families to a certain degree. And I'm not even suggesting that wealth distribution is the answer to that, but we have to take it seriously. Let me move on. Repayment of marital loans was reduced by 10% of the principal for each child a couple had. Married men with more than 6 children paid no taxes. No taxes. Wow. Bachelors between the ages of 25 and 65 paid increased taxes. The Italian civil service only employed parents. The state-owned railroad dismissed female employees since they should be at home producing and caring for babies. And later, private industry did the same. Okay, let's stop there. Loans were reduced by 10% for each child. You have 6 children, you pay no taxes. What's the problem? What's the problem? I don't see a problem. That's one way to support families right there, to encourage people to have children, to lessen the burden on them, right? It may not have to be, like I said, direct wealth redistribution, but simply to take the burden of taxation away to whatever degree. Obviously, you got to go through every individual tax system and figure out how to create these incentives. But at that time in Italy, men were alleviated of the tax burden when they were fathers of homes. And this is what they were trying to encourage, right? Next line, bachelors between the age of 25 and 65 paid increased taxes, all right? Now, this one here is a critique because it suggests that the government is manipulating men to getting married and having babies. Okay, let's stop right there. What's the problem with this one? First of all, we have something in America called the Child Earned Income Credit, the Child Tax Credit. That is also designed to help out families. So nothing here really contradicts what we're doing even today, understanding that raising families is very difficult. But even more so, as we've seen in modern times, men have been ostracized from society because of liberalism and feminism. Is it really good that men don't have children? I would argue as a married man that marriage fulfilled me, that marriage was a great thing, that marriage gave me a certain sense of duty and honor and responsibilities. The kind of society we have today, the liberal society, where men are discouraged or men have very little opportunity to be prosperous, right? In this heavy tax system that discourages men and punishes men at every turn for marriage, and men staying home playing video games and watching porn. I just don't think that's the healthiest civilization you could create, but that's what we've done. But no, the horror is in Italy in 1920s and 30s, bachelors between 25 and 65 were charged more taxes. I don't see a problem with this. Again, I'm reading this from my perspective. The Italian civil service only employed parents. Okay, yeah, they were providing jobs for men, so men could be providers. See, we've fallen into this trap since the sexual revolution and the rise of feminism in America, that somehow this crazy idea that men and women are supposed to go into the workforce and compete against each other for resources, right? When in fact, this society, and it is a Catholic society, view the world in a way where men and women were complementary to one another, working for the betterment of the family. You wonder why family life in Italy in the 20s and 30s, and even before that, was much healthier than the state of the family today in Western liberal republics? Guys, we got to make this connection. And while I understand the pressures of feminism and the anti-patriarchal sort of sentimentalities we created is a lot of pressure, because, hey, women got to go into the workforce, women got to climb the corporate ladder, and women got to make the money just like the men. I understand. That's where we're at now. But don't tell me it's healthier. Don't look at the end result and ignore the destruction of culture, society, and the family. Not only are we not having children anymore, but we have the family that's been absolutely obliterated, precisely because men and women, in part, right? In part, men and women are competing for the same resources. And men and women were not intended to do that. I'm sorry if this is controversial from our liberal paradigm, but yes, I believe women being homemakers is the ideal, and men being the bread earners is the ideal. This is what the fascist nation was trying to accomplish in Italy. But from our liberal sensibilities, oh, look how evil fascism was. One more, slap in the ass out the door as we sort of cast it off into the ash heap of history. Guys, look what's happening here. This is perfectly Catholic. This is a Catholic civilization. Now, I would have to get more into the details of this, and I'm sure, again, with government, there was corruption in the fascist government. We know that. I get it. But I'm appealing to the general sentimentalities here, the general understanding of what they're trying to do. This piece here that I'm reading to you is supposed to be an objection to the idea of, okay, women being made into baby factories, right? Which is, again, purely liberal propaganda in how it's being described, because what the fascist nation was doing in conjunction with the church is simply following natural law and natural order of how the family had been viewed within the realm of Christendom, going all the way back to our Lord Jesus Christ. What is the role model of Catholics when we look at the family? It's Jesus, Mary, Joseph. It is the Holy Family. This is what the society, to a certain extent, is trying to mimic, only dealing with modern economies and how the family is going to survive. Because the family in Western liberal republics, starting with America, has not survived. It has been absolutely destroyed and obliterated. In 1925, women were given the right to vote in local elections. In 1926, local elections were abolished. That's because Mussolini took authoritarian rule in 1926. He abolished democracy in Italy. That's why. Women were given 2 months of paid maternity leave beginning in 1934, and factories employing more than 50 women had to have designated rooms where mothers could nurse their infants. Okay, so wait a minute. In the paragraph above, women were ostracized from the workforce, but in the paragraph below, women were still working. Well, of course they were still working. Women always worked, right? Because there was preferential treatment in certain roles, because fathers needed to be the bread earners, right? We kind of, okay, see, women were ostracized from the workplace. Women have always worked in all societies. They always have. Maybe there's different roles. Maybe there's different, circumstances, things of that nature. But here again, we give the implication first that women were forced out of the workforce, and yet here the fascist nation is accommodating women in the workforce. Notice the contradiction. In 1939, women who had 5 children got a medal from the state. A bow was added to the ribbon on the medal for each subsequent child. The decoration did not help to feed or clothe large families, excuse me. Okay, the medals, they're giving out awards, they're elevating motherhood. That's what they did. I don't see the problem again. The decoration, of course, it says here, did not help to feed or clothe large families. Well, I mean, they had subsidies in place. That's the problem. If we're going to take the general idea that Italy, specifically the South Sicily, was a poor nation, yes, but you're conflating issues here. You're conflating the idea of motherhood and families and how we feed this with a general lack of economic activity in a nation that lacks resources. That was the point of the program, to try and assist a poor nation so they could have more kids. Again, this is one contradiction after another. You see the liberal bias here. The Catholic attitude to born out of wedlock was nearly impossible to overcome in Italy as compared with Nazi Germany. The fascists eliminated the possibility of unmarried women anonymously turning newborns to convents or orphanages. This was a good change, since Italian orphanages farmed out illegitimate babies to ignorant and disreputable wet nurses who ran so-called founding homes. Over one half of the infants sent to the founding homes died. With me, single mothers did not have to register as paupers, and better still, the mothers were supporting and keeping and caring for their babies. Okay, whatever all that means. But notice the first line there. Notice the first line. Children born out of wedlock was nearly impossible to overcome in Italy. Yeah, it was a stigma. It was a stigma of shame and blame. Try going into certain ethnic communities in America where you have 70% out of wedlock births. Tell me how that is worked out for those communities. Tell me how all the, again, children born out of wedlock in America is doing for us here. They understood this a long time ago, that children born out of wedlock are born into very bad or very dangerous or very obstructive circumstances. Don't want children being born out of wedlock. That's why you discourage it. That's why there's something called shame and blame. It's a good thing. It encourages women to stay pure. It encourages women to be virtuous. And in many respects, it helps men to control themselves to a certain degree and to encourage marriage within men. Imagine the horrors of fascist Italy because they said, you know what? Children out of wedlock, it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. And yet we have liberals here in America arguing, oh, look how oppressive this regime was because it discouraged out of wedlock birth. I mean, this is insane to me, guys. It's absolutely insane, the logic and the reason of our liberal society. And these are the kind of things that are used to judge other cultures and civilizations from another time, again, to build up our own liberal egos in the West, to say we're number one, we're the greatest, we're the best of all time, rah, 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 right? It's insane to me. As far as the newborns to convents and orphanages, I highly doubt that if children needed a place to go, that the church was rejecting those kids. I highly doubt it, because you could do this anonymously anyways. What else? Okay. Of course, the idea of racial purity entered fascist law. Italians were not to marry people of African descent. Later, non-Aryans, Jews were added to the list. Okay. The racial thing in Italy was not very prevalent, right? We all know that Mussolini, up until the 1938 Jewish discrimination laws, had very good relationships with Jews. In fact, in Italy, the Jews, the 50,000 Jews that lived in Italy around Rome area since the time of Christ, had great relationships with the Italians. a lot of the stories we hear about Jews usually come from like Eastern Europe. That's where they have major problems. The 38 discrimination laws really had to do more with Zionist elements that were infecting Italy, and that's for another show, right? As far as the racial purity about not marrying Africans, that has to do more with Italian colonization, particularly in Ethiopia after 1936. Now, what happened in Ethiopia, right? Italy goes in there, wins the war. It colonizes Ethiopia. Now, you got to remember who Mussolini is. Mussolini is a Roman, and citizenship is a very big deal in the idea of, you know, the Roman Empire and the history of how Italians and Romans think. Um, Unlike the British, unlike the French, and in many ways, unlike the Americans, when Italy conquered a nation, when the Romans conquered a nation, it used citizenship to bring them into the fold, right? The British Empire, for example, when it went all over the world to colonialize, it really exerted or it really took the resources of the conquered nation, brought it back home, right? And they were very brutal against the indigenous population we just conquered. Mussolini didn't do it that way, right? In the who is it? Not Jonah Goldberg, the other Goldberg, Martin Goldberg, I believe is what it is. The Truth About Mussolini. He talks about how when Italy went into Ethiopia, it went in there to make it not only just make Ethiopia part of Italy, but to make Ethiopian citizens Italian citizens, to bring them into the fold and to give them equal rights to Italians. The problem is, once a conquering nation goes into a colonial nation, oftentimes the victors of war are seen as the heroes. And what you had was a lots of, I guess, what do you want to call it? Patronizing between the conquering men and the conquered women with one another. Mussolini saw this as a problem because if Italians were now courting African women, taking effectively women away from indigenous African men, you were going to begin to create resentment. Mussolini, as he even criticized Hitler in Operation Barbarossa, always believed that the conquering nation had to be civilized with the conquered people to make them part of the fold. This was a Roman idea, again, right? This is why in her book, her autobiography of Benito Mussolini, Rochelle Mussolini, told us a story how Mussolini bitterly complained when he flew a plane over to the eastern front of the war and how the Germans were just brutalizing the Russians, that they were conquering on their way to Stalingrad eventually. Mussolini's complaint was, this is not how you treat people, right? If you're going to bring people into the fold, you don't brutalize them. You kind of make them part of the family. Right now, obviously, there's nuance there, and you got to figure out how that all works at the end of the day. But this is how Mussolini saw things. He was not a brutal conqueror, despite all the claims we hear about, well, he used poison gas. That's war, right? And there's nuance there as well, too, because the British were involved in that war, which nobody ever mentions. But the moment Italian men start patronizing or start, you know, with the African women in that part of Ethiopia, now you got a problem. You don't want a bunch of African men who have been pushed out, who've had their women taken away from them, effectively. This is why he passed the law at the end of the day. Now, is there a racial aspect to this? I'm sure there was, all right? Mussolini and fascists believe in, again, cultural hegemony. So I'm not saying it's purely for war reasons, right? I'm sure there's cultural reasons there, but it's more nuanced than that. This here is an attempt to give purely a racist perspective on why those laws were passed. Again, this is liberalism. This is a liberal perspective on another culture, another time, another place, and another system altogether. This is what we do in the West. In the liberal West, we create narratives rather than look at nuance and try to understand why people do what they do. Right? This shows the liberal bias of this article and the framework in which most Americans have been raised in. So we don't look at these things honestly. And this is what upsets a lot of the world with Americans, that Americans are lazy. They're flat out lazy. that our egos are so big that nuance doesn't matter, that details don't matter, that the American narrative can be passed along because of a usury economic system that dominates everything we do. And at the end of the day, okay, we're number one, we're the greatest of all time. When in fact, why don't you try to understand people and what they were going through? Americans are bad at that. Okay, and finally, fascist anti-feminism did not produce the desired results. The birth rate dropped between 1911 and 1936. Mortality rates increased. Abortion rates apparently tripled, even though it was all law in Italy. And so basically, it's a bunch of statistics. I'll leave it up there for you for a second. You guys can read it yourself. So basically, not only was it morally disordered from this liberal prism, what the fascists tried to do, to use motherhood in a way to subjugate women, but it also was a grand giant failure at the end of the day, as all the statistics prove that the fascists failed. All right. So let's talk about this for a second, okay? And listen, I haven't gone through the numbers, right? I'll play what this gentleman has to say. There's nothing I trust about the article in the first place, but I'll play the game. Let's talk about birth rates, right? Whether they increased in Italy or not at the time really doesn't matter. It is the general sentimentalities of a Catholic nation that was trying to live up to its values. Now, when you look at historical birth rates, they've actually been collapsing going back prior to the 1850s, right? Almost 100 years from this time period, because birth rates really begin to decline really post-industrial revolution. Once the industrial revolution happens, big cities are formed, right? People's behaviors begin to change. For one, you're losing lots of children prior to the 1850s. Because of the Industrial Revolution, or prior to the Industrial Revolution, medicine, things of nature, technology that we have. But if you look at the trajectory of populations of the West, it's been declining since the 1850s. To point to the, again, the fascist system and their encouragement of trying to grow the population as being something failed as a negative attribute is a dishonest situation. It's a dishonest assessment, I should say. Because in America, again, right, the most prosperous, wealthiest nation in the history of the world, that's what we are. That's how I was raised in conservative camp. We're down to 1.6. Again, if materialism is what is key, if economic prosperity is what is key to have children, then why doesn't America today lead the world in childbirth? We should be the ones leading the entire world historically, but we don't do that. There are social changes and social fabrics and social structures that were going on even in Italy back then, including, again, the ill effects of the French Revolution that was sweeping all through Europe throughout the 19th and in the first half of the 20th century. We can't forget that. And I bet you if you look into the numbers, it was southern Italy that was probably having more children than northern Italy, which was more secularized. These things matter, right? Can't look at these things in a vacuum. You got to look at these things with great detail and great nuance and have a true understanding to really want to know what happened rather than to use statistics to make a political point to simply confirm your liberal sentimentality. This is a dishonesty of it all, right? And again, the notion that as liberals, right, in post-World War II Western republics, that we should critique anybody having the idea and the social structure to increase their population when all of our populations of the West are dying, when our families have been destroyed, when our cultures have been reduced down to a pile of ashes, when our political systems are corrupt as hell. To look at those other cultures and criticize them when we should be the first to look in the mirror. I mean, that is the height of arrogance. That is the height of delusion. And this is what we do in the West under the dictates of liberalism. This is why virtually anything I hear, whether it's the media or even from a more scholastic source, you really can't trust it. You have to do the research for yourself. And so Mussolini's baby factories, was it a horrid system that oppressed women and motherhood, suppressed feminism and women's rights. No, no, it simply conformed to the natural roles that within the realm of Christendom we've always understood that men are providers, women are homemakers, women are there to raise children. It is the women of the world, the women of our societies and cultures that raise the men at the end of the day. Women have a vital function given to them by God to be mothers. And to be honest with you, it's the most important job of all. It is more important than the bread earner. The problem is, again, our liberal sentimentalities that have reduced everything down to the material dialectic doesn't give motherhood a value in modern liberal societies, right? Right? Think about this world we created post French and American Revolution. Think about this for a moment, where everything of value is determined by this material dialectic, right? Where it's a rush or it's a race to accumulate resources, where the faith has become indifferent through religious liberty, where the faith has been diminished and destroyed by liberalism, right? What makes you a great citizen in the West, especially as Americans? What makes you a great citizen? It's how much material wealth you acquire. It's about your career. It's about your investment portfolio. It's about the house you own. It's about the career title you have. It's about the material, what do you want to call it? It's about the material credibility that you've earned. And so when the entire world becomes this war between Marxists and capitalism about who controls the resources, and yet you have women at home who their biological and natural nature says, stay home, raise babies, this is your primary duty. How do you tell women now in this world of materialism, stay home, make babies, when it's not profitable, when there is no material end to this role? Women can never become great citizens in these liberal, godless societies. You want to know why many have taken to going out into the workforce? Now, many have been pushed there. That's the other thing we don't talk about, right? We push women out into the workforce. Many women who have a natural inclination to want to stay home and have children and be mothers, they prefer to be there. They get ignored completely. But for the women that have been seduced by liberalism and feminism, right? How can you tell them to stay home when the greatness of a citizen in the liberal world is to accomplish and achieve material prosperity? Were men and women designed by God to go out in the economic work engine of prosperity and climb up the corporate ladder where they compete with one another? Were they? Why was the Italian government taking preferential treatment of men in the workforce? It was to keep the natural order. You need men to be providers. Men could be providers, and they got preferential treatment. It balances the natural order. If you take jobs away from men and give them to women, what happens to men? They stay home, they watch porn and play video games. That's what they do. There's no need for them because men are natural providers. The hunter, the gatherer, before our modern sensibilities, our modern technology made this all possible. Feminism could never rise, not to this degree. But through the rise of liberalism, the natural order of the sexes has been disordered. And again, look at the state of our culture. Look at the state of the family. Look at the state of our political systems. It's all been shot to hell. That's all I can say. And here we have one culture, civilization, that was trying to head this off because they saw it coming, right? It's like I told you guys so many times before. It wasn't like, we as Americans think we're facing all these things for the first time. No, we're about a century behind what Europe was going through because of the French Revolution. We had those bodies of water, the Pacific and the Atlantic, that protected us from Marxism, from Bolshevism, from the French Revolution, that was spreading all this social and moral disorder all over the continents of Europe and Asia. Then it finally gets here, and we think it's a unique thing. When in fact, it's not. They were dealing with these problems long before we were. But of course, as Americans, right, with our nation in a total free fall now, culturally, politically, morally, our liberal sensibilities are offended because we have a narrative that we have to subscribe to. Listen, guys, I'm not saying everything that was being done in fascist Italy was perfect. I'm not saying that. But in regards to protecting the family, whether this would have worked or not, I don't know. Right? And we'll never know because it was put to an end. But the general sentimentalities of a nation that's trying to grow its empire and finds common cause, follows the natural dictates of God, follows natural law where it has roles for men and women, there's nothing offensive here. And this is why this civilization, culturally, morally, socially, was much more healthier than what we have today. My family was from that culture. Families stayed together. And this idea, and I'll close with this. This is to me is really the big one here. The idea that they failed in getting birth rates up based on these statistics that this pediatrician here likes to give us. Listen, I don't know about these statistics, but I came from that world. I'm a byproduct of that world, and I knew people in that world that lived in Italy in the 20s and 30s. My entire family came there. I'm purebred Sicilian. Like I said, my father's family was all born in the middle of Mussolini's reign. And regardless of what these statistics say, that the population dropped, I'm going to tell you right now, the average Catholic family in Italy was 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. 7 on my father's side, 7 on my mother's side. Those nations, those cultures had children. They didn't contracept. They didn't abort their children. They didn't say, okay, I got to go make the money first and then have a family sometime in my 30s, which means you're never really going to have families, are you? Right? Pursuing the economic engine of prosperity, pursuing the material wealth that in the West now is God. That's the irony of it all. So regardless of statistics, I'm going to tell you right now, if you came from that world, if you had families and grandparents or great-grandparents that you knew, and I knew my parent, well, I knew my grandparents on my mom's side, right? That my father's side, they died very young. They died after my father was born. But if you know people from that world, they had children, and they had a lot of children in those Catholic nations. The fact that Italy's population is dying off now is a byproduct of the infiltration of liberalism after World War II. Now, was the population rate, the fertility rate in Italy as high in 1935 as it was in 1850? Probably not. Like I said, but there's different reasons for that. Modern technology, travel, there could be all kinds of factors. Social dysfunctions, alienation that was swept through because of Masonic Revolution, World Wars, Spanish flu. There's all kinds of reasons why the population may have dropped. But if you know anybody from that world, I guarantee you they came from a big, beautiful Catholic family. And there is no shame in it. It is our time now. It is our liberal world now where the family has been destroyed. Nobody has kids anymore. Everybody's pursuing this economic usury, materialistic dialectic thing that the West has pushed. And what good has it done us? What good has it done us? It has destroyed all of our families. This is the kind of liberal bias that should just piss everybody off. Piss everybody off. The kind of thing that we need in the West after we have failed miserably to boost our own egos, to say, look how much better we are, when we, in fact, we're failing on a daily basis. And we look at other nations, try to beat up on them to make ourselves feel better when those cultures and societies actually got a few things right. There you have it. That's the bias that we see from the liberal West. Mussolini's motherhood machines, mother factories, whatever you want to call them. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? You decide. But what we have today, I can tell you that it ain't good, because we're not even having kids anymore now. And then we complain about immigration? Really? There you go, ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.